I stood near the front row, staring at the polished mahogany casket that held my father. The church was quiet, filled with distant relatives and old family friends. Yet behind me, I could hear the whispers. My own mother, brother, and sister, laughing softly, pretending to mourn while mocking me under their breath. "She only came for the inheritance," my sister Heather whispered, her voice sharp enough to pierce through the music. "Just wait till she realizes there's nothing left for her." I kept my eyes on the flowers. White lilies. My father's favorite. I tried to stay calm, but my hands trembled slightly as memories of the years I spent alone flooded back. The nights I went hungry. The messages they never returned. The doors they shut in my face. I told myself I wouldn't cry, not for them. Maybe for him. Maybe for the father who, once upon a time, believed in me before they turned him against me. Mason, my older brother, caught my eye and smirked. He leaned toward Heather and muttered something that made her laugh out loud, even during the prayer. I wanted to leave right then, but something in me said to stay. Maybe it was loyalty. Maybe it was the quiet voice in my heart that told me this wasn't over yet. After the service, people gathered outside, offering condolences that felt more like gossip. My mother didn't even look at me. She passed right by, linking arms with Mason as if I wasn't her daughter. When an old neighbor asked how I'd been, Mason cut in and said, "She's still finding herself. You know how some people never grow up." Everyone laughed. I didn't respond. I just smiled politely, the way I had learned to when people mistook cruelty for humor. Deep down, I was tired, not just of the pain, but of the years I'd spent trying to earn their respect. They'd already written my story in their heads. The daughter who left, the disappointment, the one who didn't belong. But what they didn't know was that my father and I had spoken a few weeks before he died. It wasn't a long conversation, but it was the first real one we'd had in years. He had sounded weak, but there was something different in his tone, regret. He told me he wanted to see me soon, that there were things he needed to make right. I didn't understand then what he meant. Now, standing by his grave, I felt that same heaviness in my chest. A quiet knowing that something had been left unfinished. As my family laughed and talked about their next vacation, I took one last look at the headstone and whispered, "I'm here, Dad." I kept my promise. They thought I was invisible. They thought I had nothing. But I knew something they didn't. My father wasn't a fool. And whatever he had planned, I was about to find out. For as long as I can remember, I was the outsider in my own family. I wasn't the loud one like my sister Heather or the golden child like Mason. I was just Alyssa, the quiet one who worked hard, kept to herself, and never quite fit the picture my parents had of what a successful Parker should be. When my father had his stroke 6 years ago, everything in the family shifted. Mason's construction business was already in trouble, but instead of taking responsibility, he turned to my parents for help. They didn't have enough savings, so they looked to me. I had just received a small inheritance from my grandmother, money I'd been saving to buy a small home. Mason and my mother both came to me with tears and guilt. They said it was my duty to help keep the family name afloat. At first, I wanted to. I loved my father, and I didn't want to see the family fall apart. But when I asked Mason for a business plan, something that showed where the money would go, he got angry. He said I was questioning him, disrespecting him as the man of the family. My mother took his side, saying, "You've always been the selfish one, Alyssa. You care more about money than your brother's future." That night, I realized it didn't matter what I said. They had already chosen their side. I refused to sign over the inheritance, and that was the moment they turned on me completely. My father, weak and confused from the stroke, didn't say much. He just looked away, letting the silence speak for him. After that, things went downhill fast. Mason spread stories to our relatives that I'd betrayed the family. Heather stopped answering my calls. Even my mother returned my letters unopened. It was like I'd been erased. I left town not long after, renting a small apartment and working 2 jobs to stay afloat. It was hard, lonely most days, but at least I had peace. I promised myself I wouldn't depend on anyone again. I stopped expecting apologies or phone calls. The Parker family carried on as if I had never existed. Over the years, I heard bits and pieces from neighbors and old friends. Mason's business kept failing despite new investors. Heather got married twice and divorced twice. My father's health kept getting worse. I wanted to visit him, but my mother told me not to bother, said he didn't want to see me. That broke me for a long time. Still, I couldn't bring myself to hate him. Deep down, I believed my father knew the truth, that I wasn't selfish, just tired of being used. I didn't know it then, but he had seen everything. Every lie. Every manipulation. I thought my story with them had ended 5 years ago. But life had a strange way of circling back, especially when the truth had been buried for too long. When I got the call that my father had passed away, I sat in silence for a long time. I didn't cry right away. I just stared at the wall, trying to process what those words meant. He was gone. The man who once tucked me in at night, who taught me how to ride a bike, who later became a stranger in his own home, was gone. At first, I told myself I wouldn't go to the funeral. It had been 5 years since I last saw any of them, and I knew how it would be. The whispers, the stares, the same old judgment. But the night before the service, I found myself sitting on the floor with an old photo album in my lap. There was one picture of me sitting on my father's shoulders at the lake, both of us laughing. That memory was enough to make me decide. No matter how they treated me, I needed to say goodbye. The morning of the funeral, I arrived early. The church was quiet, filled with the faint smell of flowers and polished wood. I stood at the back for a moment, watching people file in. When my mother Lorraine saw me, her face hardened instantly. Her eyes were cold, sharp, and distant, like she was looking at someone she despised. She didn't say a word, just turned away as if I didn't exist. Mason arrived next, dressed in an expensive suit that didn't match the occasion. He looked at me, smirked, and leaned toward Heather, whispering something that made her laugh. I heard her say, "I can't believe she had the nerve to show up." Mason replied just loud enough for me to hear, probably hoping Dad left her a few scraps. I swallowed hard and found a seat near the middle, away from them. A few of my father's old co-workers nodded politely, not knowing what to say. The pastor began to speak, his voice echoing through the hall, but my focus kept drifting to the front, to the casket. It didn't feel real. During the hymns, Heather stood 2 rows behind me, talking under her breath. "Gold digger," she muttered when I bowed my head to pray. My mother didn't stop her. Mason even snickered. I tried to block them out, holding on to what little peace I could find in the pastor's words. When the service ended, people began to line up to offer condolences. My mother refused to look at me. When one of her friends came over to speak to me kindly, Heather quickly pulled her aside, whispering something that made the woman's face change. She didn't come back. I stood there, feeling like an uninvited guest at my own father's farewell. The people who should have been my family made me feel like a stranger. But even then I stayed, because I wasn't there for them. I was there for him, to say one final goodbye to the only part of my family that had ever truly mattered. After the service, everyone gathered in the church hall for lunch. Tables were lined with food and flowers, and the room buzzed with the sound of quiet chatter. I stayed near the corner, just trying to keep to myself. I didn't want a scene. I wanted to eat a small plate of food, greet a few kind faces, and leave quietly. But with my family there, peace was too much to hope for. Mason walked over holding a cup of coffee, pretending to be friendly. "Haven't seen you in years," he said, forcing a smile. "You look different. Guess struggling builds character, huh?" Before I could respond, he leaned forward, pretending to adjust something on the table, and accidentally spilled the hot coffee all over my dress. The brown stain spread across the pale fabric instantly. I gasped and stood up, dabbing at it with a napkin. Mason raised his hands like it was no big deal. "Oh, come on, Alyssa. Don't be so dramatic. It's just coffee." He laughed, and the sound cut deep. Heather joined in from across the table. "Guess she can't afford to buy another one," she said loudly, making sure everyone nearby could hear. A few cousins chuckled awkwardly, unsure whether to laugh or walk away. I wanted to shout, to call them out for the cruel, childish people they were, but I didn't. I sat back down, wiping at the stain, refusing to give them the reaction they wanted. Mason kept smirking, clearly proud of himself. He had always liked making me look small. Heather was no better. She thrived on humiliation. A few minutes later, she started telling one of her favorite stories, one I had hoped everyone had forgotten. "Remember when Alyssa pawned her jewelry just to pay rent?" she said with a fake laugh. "Mom was so embarrassed she told the neighbors she lost them in a move." Everyone at her table laughed. I just sat there, gripping the napkin so tightly that it tore in my hand. My mother didn't say a word. She sat next to Mason, nodding slightly, as if she approved of the mockery. I looked at her, searching for any trace of warmth, any sign that she might still see me as her daughter. But she just looked away. It felt like I was right back in that house again, the invisible one, the one no one stood up for. But this time was different. I wasn't that broken girl anymore. I had learned how to keep my silence and hold my ground. I reminded myself that I hadn't come for them. I came for my father. I finished my meal in silence while they laughed and whispered. If they saw my calm as weakness, they were wrong. I was quiet, yes, but not defeated. I could feel something shifting deep inside me, a strange peace that came from knowing that the truth, sooner or later, always finds its way to light. And mine was coming. 2 days after the funeral, I got a call from my father's attorney, Richard Collins. He said the family was gathering at his office that afternoon for the reading of the will. My stomach tightened at the thought of sitting in the same room as them again, but I agreed to come. I told myself it was one last thing to get through, one final step before I could finally move on. When I arrived, everyone else was already there. Mason stood near the window, dressed in another expensive suit, talking loudly about taking over Dad's legacy. He spoke as if he already owned everything, his voice full of confidence and entitlement. Parker Contracting will finally be in capable hands, he said to one of our cousins, making sure I could hear him. Heather sat beside our mother, tapping through her phone, occasionally glancing up to smile smugly. The room was quiet except for their small talk. I sat at the end of the table, next to a plant, trying not to make eye contact. My mother ignored me completely, flipping through some papers she had brought. She hadn't spoken a word to me since the funeral, and I didn't expect her to start now. Richard entered the room a few minutes later. He was calm, polite, and professional. "Thank you all for coming," he said, taking his seat at the head of the table. "I know this is a difficult time, but your father wanted his affairs handled carefully and respectfully." Mason leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Let's just get to it," he said. "We already know how this is going to go." Heather laughed softly, brushing her hair back. "Yeah, Dad always wanted Mason to have the business," she said confidently. "And I'm guessing I get the lake house." I stayed quiet. I didn't know what to expect. My father and I hadn't talked much in the last few years, not since the argument that tore the family apart. But in my heart, I hoped for something simple, maybe a letter, a small note to say goodbye. Something to show he remembered me. Richard began to read. His voice was steady as he went over a few smaller details first, sentimental items, savings accounts, and donations to charities my father supported. Mason was already half smiling, waiting for his turn. Heather was leaning forward, nodding as if everything was already decided. As Richard continued, I noticed something in his tone shift, a seriousness that made Mason sit up a little straighter. "Your father," he said carefully, "was very clear about how he wanted his estate divided." Mason folded his arms, pretending to be calm, but I could see the impatience in his eyes. Heather looked excited. My mother reached over and patted Mason's hand like it was already his. I just sat there, silent, my hands folded in my lap. I didn't realize then that everything they believed, all the pride, all the confidence, was about to collapse. My father had left behind more than just a will. He had left behind the truth. Richard adjusted his glasses and began to read from the stack of papers in front of him. The room grew quiet, except for the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Everyone sat straighter, waiting for their names to be called. He started with the smaller details. "To my wife, Lorraine Parker," he read, "I leave my personal belongings, including the contents of our home, family photographs, and keepsakes." My mother nodded proudly, her hand resting on her pearl necklace. Then he mentioned small gifts for the grandchildren, savings bonds, a few family heirlooms, and letters written to each of them. It was calm and polite, just as everyone expected. Mason leaned back in his chair, confident, drumming his fingers on the table as if waiting for the real part to begin. Finally, Richard looked down again and said, "To my son, Mason Parker." He paused for a moment, his tone unreadable. Mason straightened up, flashing a quick smile at Heather. "I leave a lesson in humility." The words hung in the air like smoke. A few cousins exchanged puzzled looks. Heather snorted, thinking it was a joke. "Dad always had a sense of humor," she said softly, chuckling. Mason's grin faded instantly. "Excuse me," he said, his voice sharp. Richard didn't respond right away. He flipped to the next page and continued reading as if nothing unusual had happened. "All business assets, including Parker Contracting, its affiliated properties, and real estate holdings, are to be transferred solely to my daughter, Alyssa Parker." For a moment, no one moved. The entire room went completely still. My mother's hand froze halfway to her mouth. Heather blinked, looking from Mason to me, unsure if she had heard correctly. Mason's jaw tightened. "What did you just say?" he demanded. Richard looked up, calm as ever. Your father left all company assets to your sister, Alyssa, he repeated clearly. Heather let out a short, nervous laugh. There's no way that's right, she said. Dad wouldn't do that. He wouldn't just give everything to her. Mason slammed his palm on the table. This is ridiculous. My father would never. But Richard raised a hand to stop him. Mr. Parker, I assure you, this is what your father wanted. These are his signed, notarized instructions. There are multiple witnesses. The color drained from my mother's face. She looked at me with something between shock and disbelief. It wasn't love or pride, it was anger. She turned to the lawyer and said quietly, There must be some mistake. I sat there frozen, my heart pounding. I hadn't expected anything, certainly not this. I thought maybe my father had left me a small note or one of his old books. But this? It didn't make sense. I had no idea why he would do this. The silence stretched on until Mason stood up suddenly, pushing his chair back so hard it hit the wall. She doesn't deserve any of it, he shouted, pointing at me. She abandoned this family. Richard didn't flinch. Your father had his reasons, he said firmly. And for the first time in years, no one in that room had anything left to say. Before anyone could say another word, Richard reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small flash drive. He plugged it into the computer on his desk and turned the monitor toward us. Your father asked that I play this after the will was read, he said. The room went silent again. Mason folded his arms, still fuming. My mother looked confused, and Heather rolled her eyes like this was just another trick. Then the screen lit up. My father appeared, sitting in his old study, the same one where I used to do homework as a child. His face looked thinner, his voice weaker, but his eyes were calm and serious. If you're watching this, he began slowly, it means I'm gone. And there are things I need to say that I couldn't while I was alive. I felt my throat tighten. I hadn't heard his voice in years, and now it filled the room like a ghost refusing to leave. My mother clasped her hands together tightly. Mason's expression shifted from anger to nervousness. I made mistakes, my father continued, his voice breaking slightly. I wasn't a perfect man, and I know I let some of you influence my decisions. Especially when it came to Alyssa. He paused and looked down for a moment. I allowed lies to come between me and my daughter, and I see now how wrong that was. Heather leaned forward, her face pale. Mason looked away, pretending to be bored, but his jaw was tight. My father took a deep breath and continued. Alyssa, you were the only one who ever told me the truth, even when it hurt. You stood up for what was right, even when everyone else turned against you. I know you tried to protect the family when Mason asked you to give up your inheritance. And I know now that refusing him was the right thing to do. Mason's head snapped up. What the hell is this? He muttered. My mother reached out to hush him, but he pushed her hand away. My father's voice grew heavier. Mason, I found out about the documents you forged, the ones that took money from the family trust to cover your business losses. I saw the bank records. And Heather, I know you helped him hide it. Heather's face turned white. That's not true, she blurted out, but no one listened. The evidence was there, spoken from the grave. I kept quiet for too long, my father said. I thought I was protecting my family, but all I did was let the lies grow. I wanted to make it right before I left this world. That's why I made the decision I did. Alyssa, you are the only one who deserves to carry forward what I built. Not because of money or property, but because of your honesty and strength. He paused again, wiping his eyes. I hope you can forgive me for not believing in you sooner. When the video ended, no one moved. The room felt frozen in time. I sat there, tears slipping down my cheeks, barely breathing. My father had seen everything after all. He had known the truth, and even though it took years, he had chosen to set things right in his own way. The moment the screen went dark, chaos broke out. Mason jumped to his feet, slamming his hands on the table so hard that the papers scattered. This is fake, he shouted, his voice shaking with anger. She manipulated him. She made him record that garbage. His face was red, veins bulging in his neck. Heather was already crying, holding her head in her hands, mumbling, No, this can't be happening. My mother, Lorraine, stood up too, pointing at me with trembling fingers. You did this, Alyssa. You always knew how to twist people's minds. You must have pressured him. My husband would never say such things. I stayed silent. I didn't need to say a word. The truth was already out there, spoken by my father himself. Richard remained calm, waiting for them to finish shouting. When they finally stopped to catch their breath, He opened a folder and spread out several official-looking papers across the table. Your father recorded this message 6 weeks before his passing, Richard said firmly. Here are the medical records confirming he was of sound mind. The video was witnessed, notarized, and filed according to legal procedure. Everything is valid. Mason snatched one of the papers, his hands shaking, scanning it like he could somehow find a flaw. This is unbelievable, he said, almost to himself. He was dying. He didn't know what he was doing. Richard calmly replied. He knew exactly what he was doing, Mr. Parker. He wanted to correct the wrongs he'd seen in his family. And he wanted to make sure this time, the right person received what she deserved. Heather let out a sob, wiping her mascara-streaked face. We were just trying to protect him, she said weakly. My mother sat back down, looking stunned, her mouth slightly open. She whispered, He betrayed us, like she couldn't believe the man she'd been married to for 40 years had chosen me over them. But I didn't see it that way. I didn't see betrayal, I saw justice. My father wasn't trying to hurt them. He was trying to tell the truth. Mason suddenly turned to me, his eyes wild. You think you've won? He said, his voice cracking. You don't deserve any of it. You're nothing. He took a step forward, but Richard quickly stood, putting himself between us. That's enough, he said sharply. You need to calm down before I call security. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was Heather's quiet crying. My mother wouldn't look at me. Mason paced the room like a caged animal, muttering under his breath. I just sat there, still, letting the weight of it all sink in. For years, they'd made me out to be the selfish one, the troublemaker, the disappointment. But now they were the ones exposed, their lies, their greed, their cruelty. And for once, everyone could see it clearly. I didn't feel joy or triumph. What I felt was something deeper, peace. My father had believed me at last. He had seen me for who I really was. And that was more valuable than anything written in that will. Mason was the first to storm toward the door, muttering curses under his breath. Heather followed, still crying, while my mother stayed frozen in her seat, looking like she had aged 10 years in an hour. I stood up slowly, my hands calm, my heart steady. Mason turned back suddenly, pointing at me with rage. This isn't over, Alyssa, he hissed. You think a few papers and some fake video will stop me? I'll fight this. I'll make sure you regret every bit of it. I looked straight at him, meeting his furious eyes without flinching. My voice came out quiet but clear. You can try, Mason. But theft from a family trust is a felony. And Richard already has every document and record your father left behind. If you want to challenge it, be ready to do it in front of the authorities. That stopped him. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked at Richard, then back at me, realizing I wasn't bluffing. Heather gasped softly, covering her mouth, and whispered, Oh my God, Mason, what did you do? Richard spoke next, his tone professional but cold. Mr. Parker, your father provided notarized proof of the forged documents. If you attempt to contest the will, the evidence will become public record, including the details of your financial misconduct. Mason's face turned pale. He clenched his fists but said nothing. The confidence he'd carried into the office was gone. For years, he'd walked around like he owned everyone, but in that moment, he looked small, exposed and powerless. Heather tried to take his arm, whispering for him to leave, but he jerked away. She set me up, he said under his breath, glaring at me. You'll regret this. I didn't move. No, Mason, I said quietly. You set yourself up the moment you decided to steal from our father's trust. You thought no one would ever find out. But he did. And now, so does everyone else. Lorraine finally stood up, her eyes full of bitterness. You've destroyed this family, she said. You should have just walked away. I looked at her sadly. I did walk away for years. You're the ones who dragged me back into your mess. All I ever wanted was peace. She didn't respond. She just turned and walked out with Heather, leaving Mason standing there alone. For a second, he looked like he might say something more, but then he just shook his head and followed them out. The door slammed behind him. The silence that followed was heavy but strangely freeing. I looked around the now empty office, feeling the weight on my shoulders lift for the first time in years. My father had known what he was doing. He'd given me not just the company, but the truth. Richard gathered the papers quietly and handed me a copy of the documents. Your father trusted you, Alyssa, he said softly. Now it's your turn to protect what he built. I nodded, tucking the folder under my arm. As I stepped out of that office, the cold air hit my face, and I realized something. I didn't need to fight them anymore. The fight was over. The truth had already done the work. For once, the control was mine. The sun was soft that morning, spreading gentle light across the cemetery. Alyssa walked slowly along the narrow path, holding a single white rose in her hand. The ground was still damp from last night's rain, and the air smelled like fresh earth and silence. She stopped at her father's grave, her name engraved beside his on the small bronze plaque he had ordered before his passing. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at his name. So much had happened since that painful day at the attorney's office. The shouting, the accusations, the truth finally coming out. Mason and Heather had both tried to fight the will, but when Richard showed the full documentation and video confession again in court, their case fell apart in minutes. Mason was later investigated for financial misconduct. Heather distanced herself from him, embarrassed by how deeply she had been involved in the cover-up. Lorraine stopped speaking to Alyssa completely, moving in with Heather for a while before selling the old family home. The house Alyssa grew up in no longer felt like a place of memories, just a shell of the pain and betrayal she had carried for years. But Alyssa didn't hold hate in her heart. She had spent too much time fighting battles she didn't deserve. Her father's final act of truth gave her peace, not vengeance. She finally understood that sometimes justice doesn't come with shouting or revenge. Sometimes it comes quietly, through truth revealed at the right moment. Kneeling beside the grave, Alyssa placed the rose gently on the headstone. "You finally saw me, Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you for believing me when it mattered." She closed her eyes, remembering the years she had spent being called selfish and ungrateful. The lonely nights when she wondered if she'd done the right thing by walking away. Now she knew she had. Her father's message had not only cleared her name, but also healed a part of her that had been broken for years. As the wind blew softly through the trees, she smiled faintly. "I don't hate them anymore," she said quietly. "They've already faced the truth. That's enough." She stood up, brushing the dirt from her hands, and looked around the cemetery. A few birds were perched on nearby stones, singing gently. It felt peaceful, not like the heavy sadness she'd felt at his funeral, but calm and light, like something had finally settled in her soul. Alyssa walked back toward her car, taking one last look at the grave. The world had turned against her once, but she had survived it all. Not by fighting fire with fire, but by holding on to integrity and patience until the truth came through. As she drove away, the radio played softly in the background. She didn't think about Mason, Heather, or Lorraine anymore. She didn't need to. They had built their downfall with their own hands that day at the funeral, mocking her without realizing that her father's final wish would expose everything. Alyssa smiled to herself, gripping the steering wheel gently. She didn't need revenge, she already had peace.